Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Crime Victims Institute webinar that will focus on prison victimization. We are so very excited and thankful that you joined us today. I'm Mary Brode, the CVI Director and an Associate Professor of Practice in the Department of Victim Studies. Here at the Crime Victims Institute, we are committed to advancing research on victimization issues in Texas by conducting research to examine the impact of crime on victims and promote a better understanding of victimization through webinars and seminars such as these. Our Victim Services Department enables current and future victim service professionals the tools to restore survivors' feelings of safety, choice, and control. As our speakers provide insight on prison victimization, it is our hope that the information presented in today's webinar will be informative and helpful to your field of service. I'd like to remind you that some of the materials in this presentation may be sensitive or emotional to you. If you find yourself in this situation and need resources, please let us know.
Dr. Mary M. Brode and members of the faculty and members of the student body of the great Crime Victims Institute of Learning at Sam Houston State University. Learning, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted and honored to be having this privilege to speak at the campus of Sam Houston State University concerning this Zoom conference, the privilege of sharing lecture with everyone here and the general public attending. My topic will focus on the criminogenic and crime-producing behaviors of sexual victimization within the criminal justice correctional system of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Rehabilitation Programs Division, on how we treat victimizers and victims who have been raped. Some have been abused sexually before they entered the prison system, and some have then been abused while being incarcerated within the criminal justice system. So whether they're victimizer or victims, we do provide counseling for these correctional clients or incarcerated persons. You'll hear me use that word, correctional clients, incarcerated persons, referring to offenders and inmates. I've been working for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for approximately 33 years, 35 years total state government, working different diverse positions. I started working for the system around the mid-1980s. During this time period, there was many newspaper articles that was printed concerning officers' communication and behavior with the correctional clients incarcerated. There was an article I read in the mid-80s where an individual incarcerated informed an officer that he needed assistance, and the officer used the colloquial slang term, "You need to learn how to throw hands," which is a euphemism for fight. At that time, in the mid-80s, a lot of the state officers were indifferent and stoic to individuals who were seeking help if they happened to have committed certain crimes, like pedophiles who may be suffering from pedophilia was the lowest on the caste system and didn't always receive the appropriate response from state officers. The incarcerated person who suffered from pedophilia, according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, better known as the Manual of Mental Disorders, this is the psychiatrist, psychologist Bible when they engage in performing their duties that has all the mental disorders. The clients that have pedophilia have these urges of recurrent sexual urges and deviant fantasies that causes them distress and interpersonal conflict when they're around adolescents. The incarcerated person that is diagnosed with pedophilia and of course is a pedophile is regarded within the criminal justice system as the lowest on the caste system, lowest on the correctional system, considered somewhat of a lumpen proletariat, and will face more ridicule than any other crime inside the prison subculture. In my ethical opinion, even among staff, uniform and non-uniform, perceive the person who's a pedophile as the lowest on the caste system. It should not be that way because they are supposed to receive treatment with equality and parity like everyone else. Now, the uniformed state officers are educated and trained during their pre-service academy, in-service academy, before they start working there, that they can't bring their personal religious, political viewpoints inside the unit, the facility. So they're trained that everyone has 14th Amendment civil liberties and social contract, equal protection and due process of laws. And they're informed and educated not to engage in violating the 8th Amendment civil liberty and social contract, was cruel and unusual punishment. And then when they go through their training, there's a lot of elaboration on deliberate indifference. Deliberate indifference all through the course of working as a state officer. Deliberate indifference is considered the conscious or reckless disregard of the consequences of one's acts or omissions. It entails something more than just negligence, but it's satisfied by something less than acts or omissions for the very purpose of causing harm or with knowledge that harm will result. In law, the courts apply the deliberate indifference standard to determine if a professional has violated a correctional client or an inmate's civil rights or civil liberties. Deliberate indifference occurs where a professional knows of and disregards excessive risk to an incarcerated person's health or safety. So, for example, if an incarcerated person approached a state officer and said, I am a member of the LGBTQ and individuals community, and some of the individuals incarcerated found out about this. They're sexually harassing me. They are coming on to me. They're engaged in extortion and bullying me. I need help. If the officer responds, well, you need to learn how to throw hands. And I'm sure you had to do that in the LGBTQ community as well. If the individual then becomes beaten or murdered or savagely hurt, the officer absolutely engaged in deliberate indifference for his failure to respond in a swift and effective manner. If the officer didn't know what to do, he should have known. Rape inside the confines of a correctional system can come from predatory persons preying on the mentally ill and the weak. Juveniles are the most vulnerable, and Congress found that juveniles are 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in adult institutions rather than juvenile facilities. And within the first 48 hours, they're subject to great exploitation. For decades now, the Prison Legal News, PLN, has chronicled human rights violations and lawsuit settlements that come at taxpayers' expense. According to Paul Wright, the founder and executive of the director of the Human Rights Defense Center and editor of Prison Legal News, PLN, the longest running independent prisoner rights publication in US history, prison rape is such a pervasive and common issue nationally that it has to be seen as part of the American prison management. In 1995, the landmark case of PREA is starting to have some individuals bringing up this act of getting PREA started. In 1995, Linda Bruntmeyer, son, committed suicide at the Clemens Unit. But she was one of the main ones leading the start of the Prison Rape Elimination Act. On September the 4th, 2003, President George Bush signed it into law. And this Prison Rape Elimination Act calls for the gathering of national statistics of prison rape, the development of guidelines, and the establishment of grants used to help states address the problem. In 2005, the Bureau of Justice found that victims incarcerated tend to be first-time nonviolent offenders, those convicted of a crime against a minor, offenders who happen to be effeminate, offenders who are not affiliated with the gang organization, and those who are believed to have violated the subterranean inmate code that snitches get stitches and wind up in ditches. Now, what that means is that if a person incarcerated informs the criminal justice authorities that someone is trying to sexually exploit him, he is violating the criminal justice code among inmates that you shouldn't inform the authorities. And someone who engages in snitching can wind up being murdered, beaten badly, or wind up in ditches. Linda Bruntmeyer's son was sent to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Clemens Unit in 1995 in Brazoria, Texas, for the crime of setting fire to a dumpster. Within days of his arrival, other incarcerated persons raped and beat him continuously. Rodney Hewlin was 5 feet 2 inches and weighed 125.5 pounds. His pleas to the state correction officers to move him away from his abusers were denied. So the beatings and sexual assaults continued. Within 7 days, Rodney Hewlin committed suicide with nowhere to turn. Hewlin committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell. I was transferred to the Clemens Unit in Brazoria, Texas, between 2010 and 2012, first as a therapist supervisor, then I was promoted to assistant program director over the Courage Therapeutic Program for youth. And while working there, it was my job description to engage in providing therapeutic counseling, correctional security, life skills, rehabilitation, making sure the clients have equality and parity to pursue college, HVAC, making sure the LCD counselors and psychologists provide them counseling for suicidal ideations. Remember, these youth are between the ages of 14 to 17. So their frontal middle lobes are not fully developed yet, and they're in prison, which requires lots of counseling. I had to make sure this was done. I had to make sure PREA is being followed. They also receive anger management counseling and a myriad of other social development areas. But unfortunately, sexual victimization occurs among youth and adults, but the youth is absolutely more likely statistically to be exploited in an adult's institution. The Prison Rape Elimination Act in 2003 established specific guidelines that all criminal justice administrators like myself are mandated to adhere to concerning security, protection, counseling, therapy, rehabilitation, housing, food, clothing, health, and safety of adults and youth in prison. So while working at the youth program, assistant program director, with youth being 14 to 17 years of age, I had to make sure that these things were taken care of, whether they committed a sexual offense or not. Everyone's going to receive counseling with equality and parity, regardless of their victimizer or victim. But while working there, not everyone embraces providing equality and parity to certain type of crimes. And that's where you may have some conflict in trying to get counseling and administrative purposes of counseling to the clients done with equality and parity, which I had to do. Now, the adults that was incarcerated at the Clemens Unit, I sought them out, the ones who were seeking internal change, to be role models and teach peer education classes to the youth. But remember, I have PREA that I have to follow, because the youth can't be around adults unless they are being supervised by uniformed security supervisors and officers maintaining direct supervision 24 hours a day. So I had the adults who were seeking internal change, spiritually and educationally, to be mentors to the youth while being supervised 24 hours a day by uniformed supervisors, teaching them life skills on how to be successful both inside the correctional system and also the free world. The incarcerated adults can't speak at all to a youth. They can't approach a youth at all unless it's approved by the Security Administration and is maintaining direct supervision for official purposes of rehabilitation. If a youth approached me and states that he is being threatened by a gang organization, bullied, or sexually harassed, according to PREA, this is what I did, regardless if it's PREA or not, I still would have done this, but according to PREA, I would separate the client from all of the other incarcerated persons, contact the gang intelligence supervisors and majors where they can interrogate the client, gather witness statements, and release custody of the client to security where they can continue providing him counseling, and then perhaps, if need be, transfer to another facility. It is imperative, according to Prison Victimization Act 2003, that all state employees follow the spirit, letter, and color of the law. It is mandatory that all state uniform professionals and non-uniform follow the law behind the law to eradicate criminogenic behaviors or crime-producing behaviors. It is essential that TDCJ, RPD, and all 50 states of American penological systems internalize and understand the law behind the law. The moral and ethical commitment of doing the right thing, regardless if a judge or police is watching you or not. Making sure that you understand that the invisible code of ethics is invisible, but it compels us to do the right thing, to making sure individuals' liberties are not violated nor protected. Some of the challenges in TDC is that right now there's shortage of officers, especially starting back with the COVID crisis around February 2020. For example, you have a unit that has 2,250 correctional clients or incarcerated persons, but they have a limited amount of mental health clinicians and mental health case managers to provide group psychotherapy sessions, individual sessions, grief counseling, anger management, and counseling for suicidal ideations. So at this time in TDC, they are short approximately 5,500 to 8,000 state correctional officers short due to COVID-19 pandemic, dwindling support from superiors, low pay, grueling nature of the work, corona pandemic that has an impact on the institution and cause a crisis. The result is that if the state officers are short and not on the unit, counseling will be stopped. And this is what happened. During the COVID crisis, they had to shut down and close facilities where counseling was stopped, and a lot of clients was not receiving their counseling. Suicide rates has went up since COVID, February 2020, with not enough officers to provide supervision to the mental health case managers and mental health clinicians. What ends up happening is they may do a quick one-on-one counseling session, but not in-depth one-on-one where the client may really need that counseling for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, suicidal ideations, or anxieties or panic attacks. And also when you're short of almost 8,000 officers, the clients are not getting the recreational activities, their therapeutic programming, their therapeutic healing, which is causing some irrational thinking and also some manic depression. It's very important to get the counseling, but if you're short of officers, it can affect the entire method of how you're going to allocate your counseling. If an incarcerated person was sexually victimized 20 years ago and they just entered prison, according to PREA, the client can send an I-214 to the UTMB mental health case managers, mental health clinicians, and inform them that they was raped 20 years ago before they even came to prison. And the UTMB mental health clinician has the power to have them relocated to another facility where they can pursue prosecution for the person that raped him, whether he was in the free world social system or incarcerated in the prison industrial complex. The UTMB professionals provide counseling as soon as the clients come in to check for acute stress disorders, gender dysphoria, gender identity, where individuals may perceive themselves as man or woman, but they're actually born a man or born a woman, but they have gender identity issues. PTSD, acute stress disorders, suicidal ideations and mental stressors, they do these diagnosis exams as soon as they enter because they want to put their stamp and pulse on the client's health before it escalates. The clients also, we have clients in the mental health diversion therapeutic program, where they administer diagnostic exams for mental health deficits. Again, like post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideations. They want to create a therapeutic healing environment for the clients. But the incarcerated persons also have to deal with the predatory behavior of other clients that are incarcerated. And what happens is they will go through what's called a systems abuse cycle. Now, incarcerated persons that have engaged in predatory behavior on correctional clients or incarcerated persons, there have been that have been sexually victimized. When that happens, we call that systems abuse, because if they received this abuse before they came in, and now they're abusing other people, the client that's been victimized is now victimizing other clients. We call this a deviant offense cycle, and we want to try to reach that client and monitor him soon before it escalates to a Pandora's box of unforeseen escalating problems. Some rape victims report that treatment from mental health and legal services is more destructive than the rape they went through, and they call it re-rape. Victims may suffer stress and anxiety after the incident is over, and the justice process, they find it to be so frustrating sometimes they don't want to go seek help. That's why it's very important that we try our best within our profession to be therapeutic to the clients. Human trafficking also is an issue. And so approximately 8 years ago, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Rehabilitation Programs Division created a program called our Roadway to Freedom program. And this program is designed specifically for prostitutes. For example, what if you have a prostitute who was forced into sexual slavery when she was 11 years of age? From Russia, China, North Korea, Sudan, India, Syria. And for 20 years, she's involved in being a forced prostitute. She gets arrested 20 years later. Now she goes to TDC with no education, no industrial skills, and social communication skills is lacking. The Roadway to Freedom program recognizes that she was forced into sexual slavery. And they created a program that will provide intervention and recovery, identifying the addictions and underlying causes of the reason this person is involved in criminality, prostitution, and what we can do to preclude her from engaging in suicidal ideations and help her to reintegrate back in the free world towards being an asset through industrial education and post-therapy. The Roadway to Freedom program addresses criminal thinking errors, suicidal ideations, domestic violence, and the history of sexual prostitution, educating the person who was involved in prostitution of the history behind it and what she can do to overcome it. Because the program goal is to reintegrate back her in society with a positive lifestyle. Also, we provide her with cognitive restructuring. All the prostitutes in this program who were former prostitutes, now they're correctional clients, Cognitive structuring is when you take a large mental step back and identify your rational thinkings. Listen to feedback from therapists, members in group, so you can take your setback as a setup for a comeback. Another program that I was a supervisor and therapist over was a sex offender treatment program for approximately 8 years. Every client in this program had engaged in raping behavior. And there's a percentage of clients that was raped before they became victimizers. But every client will receive therapy, even though they may be victimizers or victims. And every client in that program is a victimizer. And some of them are victims and victimizers. With the sex offender treatment program, the goal is trying to get the clients to understand victim empathy and also get them to not engage in victim stance. Sometimes clients will say because they was raped, that's why they engage in raping someone else. But we make sure we inform them because you was raped, that cannot be used as a pretext for you to engage in sexual exploitation. You deserve to be comforted, consoled, and loved, but that does not justify you raping someone else. They have to go to group therapy sessions, individual sessions. And these clients, when they reintegrate back in the free world, if they, for example, suffer from pedophilia or sadistic rape, they are assigned SISP, super intensity supervision program, where they're monitored 24 hours a day, GPS technology, have to meet with a parole officer 15 times a month, and they have to go to group therapy sessions, individual sessions. And if they don't, then they will be sent back to prison. The staff I work with at the NSOTP program are fully dedicated to therapy because some therapy is better than no therapy at all. You'd rather have someone who suffers from pedophilia or sadistic rapist to receive some therapy because you don't want him to come back to society as an alienated and embittered lot. The next 3 programs that I was over was called the Corrective Intervention Pre-Release Program, the Gang and Renouncement Association Program, and Serious Violent Offender Reentry Initiative Program. These programs have some of the most aggressive, violent offenders, long-term, long, brutal history. But what we try to do with these men is to take them through a lot of choices, getting them to understand that your thinking controls your behavior. If you think better, you'll act better. If you think better, you'll do better. If you think better, you will live better. And so with the programs that we have, with those 3 programs, we educate them in life skills, cognitive structuring, and also provide them with a lot of mentorship. It's very important that I say to you that one of the things that we also do is use philosophy to get the clients to understand a new way of thinking. And one of the things that I will say to them is that if they tell me that the reason why they committed a crime is because they was harmed as well, I will say to them that if you're thinking that I'm going to say to you, I understand why you murdered or raped this person, I will not. As Dr. King said, it will be folly to punish the victim, but not the victimizer. I try to tell them to try to go through a different way of thinking, try to follow new traditions. As Marx says, the traditions of the dead generations weigh like a nightmare in the minds of the living. And I want them to develop a new tradition, a new way of thinking, so there won't be any more victims. And I tell them that for self-talk, think about this when someone makes you angry. The words of Mohandas K. Gandhi. Revenge is not a valid response. It is an emotional one. You can beat me, torture me, humiliate me. All I will hand you is my dead body. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. We get them to try to internalize these concepts of philosophy as to think about this when they start to get triggered to get involving in sadistic crimes. So this morning, I went over some things pertaining to prison victimization, sexual victimization, and how we treat individuals incarcerated that have committed diverse crimes. I hope that you found this to be interesting. I will now turn this back over to Dr. Mary Bro.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for that wonderful presentation. And I think we have some questions in the chat, so I will turn it over to Alyssa and Taylor to direct those questions to you.
If you have any questions, you can place them in the chat box. But our first question is, if as a rape crisis center, we meet a client in our program who was previously incarcerated and mentions having been victimized in prison, what would be the appropriate way to engage that situation with TDCJ? This is a hypothetical question.
Yes, the first thing you should do is, the person said he was victimized before he came to prison, correct?
Yes.
What you're going to do is say, according to PREA 2003, the law is, if a person was to say they was victimized 20 years ago before they came to TDC, UTMB has to interview this person, and also, if it's possible, help prosecute the person who has victimized him. And if he's assigned to a unit facility where the client's at, they have to immediately transfer to another facility. So they have to act according to law. If it happened 20 years ago, all he has to say is, I want this person prosecuted. I want to go through the process. That's what you should say.
I'd like to clarify, the person was victimized while in prison.
Okay. Oh, so, okay, he was victimized while he was incarcerated in TDCJ.
Yes,
Okay.
It's a hypothetical question, but yes, while in prison.
Yeah, okay, well, it's the same. You see, what if he was raped while he was in TDC, the official way is you send an I-214 to UTMB, but he's not going to be thinking about filling an I-214. All he has to do is inform a security supervisor, I have been raped and I want to file charges and have this person prosecuted for raping me according to PREA 2003. That's all he has to say. Now remember, if the staff for some reason, not every officer and supervisor has a moral commitment to doing the right thing. If they don't, he's going to get his family involved to make sure they follow the law behind the law.
Our next question is, how can we practically protect prisoners from being assaulted?
A very good question. Yes, I'm glad you asked that. The agency, the unit facility, needs to have a heightened arousal. They know which clients are going to be targeted. It was already discovered with PREA back in 2003. Those that are effeminate, those that have committed a crime against a minor, those who were pedophiles, those who are first-time offenders, they know which ones. So they could just simply make sure that they have these particular individuals highly monitored at a particular cell housing area, separated from the more hardcore offenders who and also have a history of doing this. But the problem is trying to get something changed they're well aware of what they can do, but still sometimes they relapse back into the old behavior. So it's basically communicating with security saying, these 8 people are at high risk. Let's assign them to particular areas where they will not be exploited. That's the way.
Thank you. Our next question is, would a sexual assault nursing exam be conducted or forensic evidence be obtained?
I'm sorry. Would you repeat that one more time, please?
Would a SANE exam be conducted or a forensic evidence be obtained when someone is assaulted?
Yes, I forgot to inform it. Well, not that I forgot, I just didn't say it, but I was also the victim's sexual assault representative. I did that also. And the way that works out is after the person's raped, they'll call me in to be a witness, speak with the doctor, and the doctor's then examining the person and human anatomy. And then they'll call me in to communicate with the client to see if I can get him to be forthcoming with all information so the evidence can be gathered for future prosecution. So yes, that's done. They take the evidence, place to a red bag, and then the internal affairs and OIG and gang intelligence come in to see if this also involves some type of gang exploitation.
Our next question is, once a plea for help has been made by a prisoner, is solitary confinement the only solution? Or will we start to see separate detention areas to house those that feel vulnerable?
Okay, I want you to know this. Now, they ceased using the word solitary confinement around 2017 and 2018. They call it programming. But now they call it programming because you have many RPD programs that are going over there checking on the clients who are housed 22 hours every day. So they don't refer to solitary confinement, but as for the, I'm sorry, that last part, what was that second part on that too? You asked?
Will we start to see separate detention areas to house those that feel vulnerable?
Well, yeah, we have protective custody and safekeeping. We have protective custody and safekeeping. But the problem with that, though, is, you see, if they're in protective custody and safekeeping, they will be in the cell 22 out of 24 hours a day. Now they're protected from the clients, but now they're going through being in that cell 22 hours every day that can cause all type of mental health stressors, dehumanization, desensitized inside that box for that long. So it's still a slow and cruel death to have someone there 22 hours every day. Now, I will say things are better because we have a lot of therapeutic programs of people going over there to check on them continuously, but they're still in that cell 22 hours every day.
Someone commented that they worked inside TDCJ prisons for 2 years and that they've seen plenty of sex offenders and pedophiles who live in general population and don't report problems, but others have to be isolated and placed in protective custody. Do some sex offenders in prison face greater risk of harm from inmates than other sex offenders?
Absolutely. And the one that I had said earlier during the symposium, the person who has suffered from under DSM-5, who has diagnosis of pedophilia, if any of the clients find out on, and this is my ethical opinion, but I think a lot of state employees will tell you this, the pedophile is the lowest lump in proletariat, the lowest on the caste system. He's at high risk at any institution in all 50 states of North America, my ethical opinion. You'll find many authors who will tell you that as well in criminology, that the pedophile is at the highest risk, lowest caste member.
Our next question, is there a noticeable difference in how public and private prisons handle assault?
I think so. I think there's a difference between the way TDC and GO corrections handles it. You see, so like, okay, some areas, yes, I mean, there's different states and different private and public does handle it different. I know I visited some private areas and they handle it totally different the way TDC would handle it. Some happens to be more strict and more hardcore than others. Some may be more therapeutic. There are differences, yes.
Thank you. Next question is, how can we better screen potential correctional officers to combat corruption?
I think that you should, when they do their investigation, They need to do some really thorough background criminal checks. And not only that, but when they make up their questions during the interview, they need to ask them some specific questions about how they would treat someone incarcerated who may have a myriad amount of victims. How would they treat someone who's a notorious rapist or pedophile? Would they not allow him to go to breakfast and dinner? Would they not allow him to take a shower? Would they deny him medical attention? Because regardless of whatever crime a person's committed while they're sentenced to the correctional system, we can't engage in cognitive schema stereotypes or violate their Eighth Amendment civil liberty social contract. We have to provide them with rehabilitation, security, and the opportunity to seek internal change. It needs to be a thorough interview asking specific questions about specific state employees. Mostly all state employees have to go through security training. So you have to go through in-service training, no matter if you happen to be an admin specialist or a sociologist, you got to go through the in-service training. But the security uniform officers, uniform supervisors, don't have to go through therapeutic counseling training, where they can have a better understanding of how to establish effective lines of human communication with individuals incarcerated who they have dislike for or hatred for because of the crimes they committed. If they went through counseling with everyone together, the mental health clinicians, mental health case managers, state officers, parole secretaries, admin specialists, everyone going together with intense counseling on why individuals in a cell 22 hours every day engages in this suicidal behavior and what they can do to reduce the potentiality of them hurting themselves instead of finding that behavior to be something that they just don't want to be bothered with. I think that would help if they would send everyone to training together 2 weeks out of the year. I think services would improve and you would have less suicidal ideations and less suicidal attempts and less suicidal murders.
Actually, we'll ask one more question. Do you believe the snitches get stitches way of thinking should stop?
Oh, yes. Yes. This code that followed this way all the way to Killeen, Texas, where I live at. I mean, snitches get stitches and wind up in ditches. So you may have a 14-year-old coming to the Courage program, assistant program director, and he tells me, Mr. Holmes, I'm not going to engage in snitching. 14 years of age. And I've got to get him to see that Dr. King said, we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. So what happens to me, 14-year-old, happens to you as well. Trying to build that mindset. The snitches, only thing it does is cause more destruction and makes it difficult for people to report crimes.
Now, without further ado, Ms. Kelly Wright Nelson will present, and she is the director of the Crisis Center of Matagorda and Wharton counties.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I was thrilled when y'all reached out to us to ask us to be a part of this. We're fairly new to providing victim services to incarcerated survivors. So I'll be sharing some information about what we've been doing. So far, it seems to have worked really good for the prisons that we've established MOUs with. I'm going to share my screen really quick and let me know if it's working. Okay, can y'all see my presentation? Perfect. All right, so my name is Kelly Wright Nelson. I'm the executive director for the Crisis Center, and we provide services mainly to Matagorda and Wharton counties. both rural communities. I've provided services, or I've worked in the criminal justice system for about 21 years. In those years, I've predominantly worked with offenders. Back in 2018, I transitioned into victim services and joined the crisis center. So for about 18 years, I worked with domestic violence offenders and sex offenders. Before we jump into what we're doing with our local prisons, I wanted to share a little bit about our center in particular. We were founded in 1984. We're also an umbrella agency. It's a little different from a lot of centers in Texas. So we do have a sexual assault program, a domestic violence program, a shelter safe house, but we're also coupled with a children's advocacy center. And then we have a legal services program, counseling service. We also have a child care center. And we have our own forensic medical center as well, where we conduct SANE exams, and then we have a resale shop. We established an MOU with TDCJ in 2019 to provide services to 4 prison units in an adjacent county. The prisons we currently provide services to are Clemens unit that Mark briefly discussed, Ramsey unit, Stringfellow unit, and Terrell unit. We're funded currently through several state and federal grant programs, along with city and county funds. We have 35 staff members, and we're governed by a board of directors. Some of our stats from 2021, the Crisis Center provided 6,395 nights of shelter. Our legal name is Matagorda County Women's Crisis Center. We did transition that to the Crisis Center because we do provide services equally to men. So we do provide shelter services, any service at all that we provide to a female or a child, we do provide to a male. So we did provide 695 nights of shelter, 439 forensic interviews to children that were suspected of receiving some type of abuse or neglect. Our Children's Advocacy Center clients were 1,154. 827 of those were new clients. We provided 1,142 advocacy services, 85 forensic medical examinations, and community outreach. We were able to reach 7,349 clients last year. Here's kind of an overview of our services, and you'll see how some of our services overlap throughout different programs. In our domestic violence program, we offer counseling, safety planning, peer support, legal advocacy, legal assistance, protective orders. A lot of those same services transition over into our residential program and our sexual assault program as well. Our Children's Advocacy Center, we offer forensic interviews, medical evaluations, multidisciplinary team case review with law enforcement, the district attorney's office, as well as DFPS. Outreach, we offer several different programs in our schools and in the communities. So I want to hop right into PREA standards. Mark covered a lot about PREA standards, so I don't want to go over some of the same things he did, but the basics of PREA standards are to keep people safe, to protect survivors from abusers, and to provide multiple ways to report sexual assault. It's also to offer medical and mental health care for survivors, to increase accountability for those perpetrators, and to provide survivors with access to victim services. The purpose of PREA standards is to ensure that incarcerated survivors have the same exact level of care as any survivor that's in the community. So whatever type of service someone is receiving in the community, and incarcerated survivors should be able to receive that identical level of care while incarcerated as well. So as far as PREA and corrections, corrections agencies must work with a local rape crisis center or other victim service agencies to ensure services for incarcerated survivors. Correction facilities must provide survivors with access to forensic medical exams that are performed by a qualified medical practitioner, and it has to be outside of the prison facility. Rape crisis centers can decide whether or not they want to provide services or whether or not they want to enter into that MOU with those prisons. And the forensic medical exam has to be free, and there has to be no cost assessed to the inmate or the victim. Survivors must be offered a certified rape crisis victim advocate to accompany them during the forensic medical examination. or a trained inmate victim representative for the units that don't have an MOU with a rape crisis center. So as far as our center, all of our advocates are certified through the Office of the Attorney General. So any of our advocates can respond to any of the units that we have MOUs with. And also correction facilities must provide access to outside advocates through hotlines and availability through mail as well. So we also have to share those limitations on confidentiality with mail correspondence between the victim and the advocate. I'll get into this later in my presentation, but we were able to set this up through having a brainstorming session with all of the PREA coordinators and the prison wardens and several officers that came to our location from the 4 units we serve. So we were able to determine the best way to meet the needs of the survivors that we're serving and to ensure that each survivor knew the limitations of that confidential communication between our advocates and themselves. So I'm going to go through the standards a little bit. I'm not going to read them word for word, but PREA standard 1115.21 is what requires that inmates or victims and survivors that are incarcerated be offered a forensic medical examination. And this is going to be, and further down, I'll get exactly into what a forensic medical examination is. But again, it has to be free of charge. It has to be through a qualified person that's certified to perform that exam. It has to be out of the prison. So it has to be at a location that is off the unit site. And then they have to be offered a victim advocate for accompaniment or an inmate victim representative with that forensic medical examination accompaniment. PREA standard 115.33 is regarding inmate education. So inmates shall receive information explaining the agent's zero tolerance policy regarding sexual abuse and sexual harassment and how to report those incidents. In that brainstorming session and original orientation we had with the units we serve, and we learned that during their orientation, when inmates come in, they provide them this information, and then we were able to provide them with further information on highlighting our services and what we can provide. We also were able to provide them with posters to hang in their common areas and different brochures that they could stick or place throughout the prison areas as well. PREA standard 115.41/42 discusses the screening process. So this is also what Mark talked about, screening for victimization and abusiveness. So this is done within 72 hours of arrival. It's going to assess the inmate's level of vulnerability and also their level of abusiveness. It's also going to take into account their age, size, non-violent criminal behavior, non-prior history of incarceration, LGBTI status, disability, previous victimizations. And it also has to take into account the inmate's own perception of their vulnerability. So even if they score very low on this, if the inmate themselves feel like they are at high risk, that screening has to take that into account as well. PREA standard 115.51 is inmate reporting. So there must be multiple internal ways for an inmate to privately report sexual abuse and sexual harassment and retaliation. An inmate will have an option to report to a public or private entity or an office that is not a part of the agency. So it has to be an agency that's not a part of Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Reports can be made verbally, in writing, and anonymously, and from third parties. Staff can privately report sexual abuse and sexual harassment of inmates. They can report through the PREA Ombudsman or through the Office of the Inspector General. PREA standard 115.53 requires access to support services. Victims must have access to outside victim advocates, and facilities must provide contact information, which is going to be the mailing address, telephone numbers. A list of rape crisis centers can be found on TASA, which is Texas Association Against Sexual Abuse, located in the library or safe prison office. A facility must inform a victim of how communication will be monitored. So if they're allowing a victim inmate to use a phone to call a crisis hotline, if that's going to be recorded, they have to, in advance, let that survivor know that this is going to be a recorded hotline, if it's going to be saved, who's going to be monitoring that hotline, if there's mail correspondence, who's opening the mail, who gets to read the mail. So all of that has to be relayed to that survivor in advance before services are received. So when do incarcerated survivors get to see a victim advocate? So did they report the assault? Yes, then they do have a right to a forensic exam. They have a right to an investigatory interview, and they have a right to an advocate for emotional support via phone or mail. And if it's included in that MOU, they have a right to the victim advocate in person as well. If they did not report the assault to TDCJ or any official at the prison, they still have a right to an advocate. So they have a right to an advocate for emotional support through phone or mail. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to receive that forensic exam because as an advocate, we can't go to the prison and just remove that inmate and take them for an exam. So they would actually have to report that to the prison to be able to receive that forensic medical exam. But either way, an inmate does not have to report the sexual assault to the prison to receive, or to that unit to receive services from a rape crisis center. If they reach out to us directly, we will provide services. There's a step, we do a safety assessment, and then we will do pros and cons of reporting with that inmate. So this is how a crisis center can help local units or TDCJ meet the requirements of PREA. So one of the key concepts of PREA is to keep people safe. One of the basic steps that we provide is that we offer safety planning, and we do that over the phone immediately with the survivor when they contact us. If they contact us through mail correspondence, we will mail them a safety planning guide as well to protect survivors from abuse. You know, while we can't be there to intervene, we can provide resources to the inmate to help them remain safe from an abuser. Inmates have to be provided multiple ways to report. So we do have a 24-hour crisis hotline. And then we also have a post office box for offender correspondence as well. PREA requires that they're offered medical and mental health care. We do have a sexual assault forensic medical examination facility with OAG certified nurses. And then we also have advocates that are certified that can accompany to local hospitals as well. You know, it requires increased accountability through this partnership, increased prevention programs, enhanced services, accountability will follow. And then they also require to provide services and access to victim services. And that's what we're here for. That's what we specialize in is victim services. And then all this leads to enhanced PREA compliance ultimately. So this is, now we're going to discuss an advocate's role in the best practices and responses to provide a victim-centered approach. So when you look at an advocate's role in the community, we really try to operate from a victim-centered or a survivor-centered perspective. So it's all about what does that survivor need? How can we help them gain their goals or get to where they need to be? We're there to provide them support, comfort, and information. And we're also there to maintain privacy and to protect their confidentiality. With an incarcerated survivor, it is the exact same thing. You know, that we're there to operate from a survivor-centered or victim-centered perspective. We also are there to provide support, comfort, and information. We maintain their privacy and confidentiality. And all there is an added safety and security mechanism as well. Crisis intervention is an immediate supportive response for a sexual assault survivor that ensures physical, medical, and psychological needs are met. It focuses on immediacy and positive and healthy parts of the personality. So a person in crisis might experience anxiety, powerlessness, shame, anger, doubt, hopelessness, decreased self-images. So the goal is to reduce the immediate impact of the crisis, to understand or help them understand the circumstances that surrounded that victimization, and to also help the person gain healthy coping skills, capitalizing on their strengths and support system and resources and it says in the community, but in this case, it's going to be in that unit where they can overcome that victimization. And also it's to help the person move beyond the crisis so that he or she can get on with their life. Victim-centered approaches also require us to tailor the way we talk to people. So trauma-informed care is an evidence-based, systematic, and organizational approach to delivering victim-centered services that seeks to avoid re-victimizing a client. Emphasizing on safety for all involved, it acknowledges that there's a widespread prevalence of trauma and understand the impact of trauma in those that it affects. So when you're speaking to someone, instead of asking someone, why didn't you do so-and-so, or how long did that last, or why didn't you report it right away, or did you tell, or did you try to stop it, or did you yell, or why did you not, trying to place blame on the survivor for not stopping it. There are several different ways we train our advocate to speak to these survivors. And a lot of it is, maybe starting with things like, are you able to tell me more about what happened? Would you tell me more about what you're able to remember about that experience? Did anything in particular cause you to come out and tell someone about this incident today? Or what were you feeling physically, emotionally, immediately after that assault? So we really want to use more open-ended questions and move away from those questions that focus in on placing blame or fault on the victim or the survivor. Some of the common advocacy services that are provided to survivors in the community are hospital accompaniment, investigation accompaniment, support groups and education prevention programs, emotional support, advocacy, and follow-ups. A lot of the emotional support and advocacy we do with community survivors in the community over the phone or in person. With incarcerated survivors, we provide the exact same services. The only difference is that we also provide those services through mail as well. The best methods for sexual assault accompaniment. So rights of victims of sexual assault under Article 56.021 of the Code of Criminal Procedures, the right to a forensic medical examination if that occurs within 120 hours of the offense. Again, I'll get into this further into the presentation. If someone is sexually assaulted 120 hours or less, it's going to be considered an acute examination where evidence can be collected. But again, I'll go into that further later on. So talking about safety plans for incarcerated survivors, one of the main things that we discussed with our clients or with our staff, it was a very big transition from going from providing these type of services to people in the community where there's no limitations. We could safety plan, and whatever that survivor wanted for their future, we could be there to advocate for. And the sky was the limit. Unfortunately, we have to stay grounded in reality when working with survivors that are incarcerated. If their plan is, I just want to get out of prison, we have to stick to reality. We can't create a safety plan that says, okay, our goal is to get you out of prison. So safety plans need to be grounded in reality. We never want to promise anything that we can't deliver. If it's not reported, we want to weigh all the options with the survivor. What's the pros and the cons of not reporting the sexual assault? We want to also identify options and resources to increase safety. I think this was one of the things that we really enjoyed with having the brainstorming session with different officers and wardens and PREA officers from the 4 units that we provide services to. We were able to identify, who is the clergy? Do you have a psychologist on site? Do y'all have support groups? Do you have, what are all your resources for your unit? Because ultimately, when we're meeting or discussing options with that survivor, we need to know every single resource that's available inside that unit so that we can make sure that that survivor can get some sort of help in there. We also are going to help them identify safe people, both people that they feel safe to be around and people they feel comfortable to ask for help. We want to help them identify staff members that they can call upon if they need help. We want to help identify red flags that would warrant reporting behaviors to staff. make a list of phone numbers or resources for help or reporting. We want to consider options to get out of the cell in dangerous situations, and offer to provide by mail coping on the inside curriculum. We'll also discuss that curriculum further on. So as far as our mail correspondence, we do have a procedure that we decided on with the units that we provide services to. After that initial contact, we provide we send a letter each month, and then they receive one module of coping on the inside curriculum. This curriculum is amazing. If you haven't seen it before, it was created by TASA, and there's 12 modules, and we have a template that offers emotional support and encouragement that we send to that survivor. We opted to go ahead and do more of a template just to make sure that there are certain professional boundaries that were set immediately. I've worked in the criminal justice system for quite some time, so I opted to go through and do different templates for each month. That way the advocate could go in and select different templates and fill in the blanks to meet the best situation for that survivor. That way they didn't have to figure out how to write that themselves. So through that brainstorming session with the units, we decided that would be the best method. So this is kind of what our templates look like. Our initial one's going to thank them for contacting the crisis center. We're going to acknowledge their abuse, let them know that they didn't cause anything, for that abuse to happen. And no matter what crime they committed, rape is not a part of the penalty, and they have a right to be free of sexual abuse. Then we're going to list in this letter all of the resources available to them in the unit that they're in as well. We're going to provide them with a coping on the inside module. These were tailored for people that are incarcerated. It's going to be filled with different information on, like the first one's going to talk about self-care and help them understand how to do self-practice or practice self-care themselves to get them over that initial trauma that occurred. The coping on the inside curriculum in detail. Module 1 focuses on self-care. Module 2 really digs into the mixed emotions that are felt during the healing process. Module 3 examines PTSD and some types of symptoms they might be experiencing. 4 talks about beliefs and mindsets and pinpoints those beliefs and mindsets about trauma. Module 5 really hones in on stress and relaxation and examines the different way we experience stress and how we can cope with those stressful situations. 6 is anxiety and depression. 7 focuses on anger and examines the emotion of anger and how we experience it after sexual trauma. Module 8 is support and focuses on the importance of finding support and connecting with others after sexual trauma. Module 9 is trust and intimacy and how to use existing support networks to build trust. Module 10 is safety and creating a plan to think in unsafe situations and how to find safety when incarcerated. 11 is control and acceptance, building understanding and control and acceptance in their lives. And then 12 focuses on healthy relationships and examines healthy relationships and what they should look and feel like. So some questions and answers. Do inmates have to report in order to receive services? So no, inmates don't have to report the sexual assault to receive services. Regardless, they're going to receive services from us. So if they reach out to us, they're going to receive it. Do the advocates have to report the abuse? No. So as a family violence center, we have to adhere to the Texas Family Code, Chapter 93, which requires us to maintain confidentiality and privileged communication with our clients. So if a survivor that's incarcerated reaches out to us and wants it to remain confidential, we do not share that information. Does PREA cover abuse that occurred prior to incarceration? It does. So we have had inmates that have reached out to us and they were victimized as children, child sexual abuse, and we do provide services for that as well. And does PREA cover sexual harassment? It does. Reporting anonymous allegations of sexual abuse involving TDCJ staff members, if the crisis center receives a report regarding allegations of sexual abuse involving a TDCJ employee, regardless if the inmate wants to report it, that is the one time we will break confidentiality and privileged communication, and we will report that to the PREA ombudsman. And we would then provide crisis intervention services. We have not had that occur, thankfully, but if it did, we've discussed that with the units that we provide services to, and we've let them know that we would let the survivor know at that time, because of the nature of the sexual assault, that we would be reporting it, and then we would come in to provide services as well to that survivor. So forensic nursing services is a wide array of services, and under that umbrella is a SANE, which is going to be a sexual assault and nurse examination. That it consists of informed consent. So before any of our, and this is specific to our sexual assault nurse program, or to our SANE program. So before any of our SANE nurses provide any kind of sexual assault services, they're going to get informed consent. They're going to go through the process. You know, what are we doing here today? This is exactly what a SANE examination is, and we want to get consent to do this with you. We're going to get consent to touch your body. Anything that's going to be done today, you're going to consent to. And if you want this examination to stop, instantly it's going to stop. They're going to begin with a medical and forensic history. So it's going to be a long, lengthy discussion about any kind of assaults that have happened in the past, any kind of medical history. Then they're going to do a head to toe assessment, viewing any part of their skin, scalp, looking in the hair, taking photographs, a lot of times looking in their mouth, ears, if there was any kind of strangulation, looking for petechiae or any kind of bruising behind the ear. Then they're going to do a detailed anogenital examination to see if there's any kind of damage, tearing. And then there's what everybody always thinks of when you think of a SANE exam, they're thinking of evidence collection. Evidence collection is a very small portion of what a SANE exam is, a very important part of a SANE exam, but a lot of SANE exams don't involve evidence collection. So they will collect evidence, and that's what goes into the SANE kit, and that's what's sent off for testing. After that, they will provide medical treatment and medication if there's any kind of STDs or any kind of prophylactics that are needed. And then after that, our nurses are going to go to a safety assessment and then also provide discharge instructions. As far as the SANE exams, there's two different kind of SANE exams. There's an acute examination, and that's going to be anything that occurs within 120 hours of the disclosure or outcry. So if someone's sexually assaulted within 120 hours, they receive, they'll be offered everything that was on that list. If it's a non-acute examination, it's going to be more than 120 hours, and that would mean that number 5, which is the evidence collection, would go away. There's not going to be any evidence to collect after 120 hours, but there still is an option for photography. If there's any kind of injuries that photos can be taken pictures of, that is still an option. And a lot of times people ask, why would you still do a SANE exam if there's no evidence collection? Because it's very important to the healing process for a survivor of sexual assault to know that their body's okay, to make sure that they're receiving medications, and to be able to talk to someone who's an expert in that field, and to know that everything they went through and what they're experiencing is completely normal after that sexual assault. So again, here's some of the programs we provide. I put my email on here, our deputy director as well, and our outreach and training and education manager as well. If anybody has any questions at all, we are very open to helping you set up a program. We have a wide array of outreach and education programs. We are very willing to share those with anyone. So please jot down our contact information, and that is all I have. So thank you so much.
Now I'll go ahead and start asking questions for the Q&A session. So first up, we have, how many reports does the Crisis Center receive each year, and how many involve staff?
Okay, so we actually started this at last year, and it took a while for our MOU to become in effect. Right now, we're providing services to 6 incarcerated survivors. So far, we've served 6 in 1 year.
Thank you. And our next question is, can families report the victimization of people who are incarcerated?
They can. We haven't had that situation yet, but they could do that. In that situation, we would just send a general letter. We can mark it confidential on there. The units that we serve have agreed to confidential mail communication with us. So we would want to make sure that we sent a very generic letter. We would never identify any kind of allegations of sexual abuse or anything of that nature. It would just be a welcome. We just want to let you know that we have an MOU with your prison. We're sending letters to say that if you're in this unit and you ever have a problem, you can reach out to us. So we would never identify that there was an issue or that someone reported it to us. And we wouldn't want someone to get their hands on that letter and there being any kind of problem. We always want to let the survivor maintain that right to report on themselves. But we could send a generic letter to them, just identifying our services.
Our next question is, has the use of advocates for inmates been taken advantage of by inmates? If so, what are the consequences, and how are future outcries from an inmate handled if manipulation of the advocacy system is found?
We haven't at this point. That was something that, because I have worked with so many offenders previously, like I said, I've worked with sex offenders and domestic violence offenders in the criminal justice system for many years. So one of my concerns was I didn't want our resources to be taken advantage of. That was the reason why we did have a brainstorming session, and we opted for a very structured template format for communication. But no, we haven't had any incidents of inmates taking advantage of it. To be honest, we do get a lot of derogatory prank calls on our hotline, very sexually explicit. None, thankfully, ever from the prison, but we do have frequent callers that are highly inappropriate on our hotline. So our hotline callers are very experienced with working with people who are sexually aggressive on the crisis hotline, but we haven't experienced that at all within TDCJ.
How did the pandemic affect your agency assisting the inmates who were victimized?
It didn't. It didn't at all. We remained in full operation. Our shelter remained open. Our crisis hotline remained open. We were not able to, or we didn't have any calls requesting us to go into the prison. We didn't have any calls stating there were any kind of acute sexual assault occurrences that needed to be handled. So I don't know if we would have been allowed in the prison, but our correspondence was still able to be maintained throughout the pandemic.
Where does counseling take place? Is it over the phone or face-to-face? And if it is face-to-face, where does it take place as far as location? So
currently, our units have opted not to utilize our counseling services. So they're using our advocacy services and our sexual assault services. So a lot of the units, they have their own support staff on their units, they utilize that. And if something occurred, then we would just cross that bridge. In our MOU, we have signed that we would provide it face-to-face in the unit. We will do telehealth and we will do over the phone as well, but we haven't utilized any of those services yet.
Is there specific training for advocates who work with people who are incarcerated?
Yes, I was not able to find a lot of training. TASA has quite a bit of YouTube videos that you can watch that are very informative. What we did was myself and my deputy director went through and watched a ton of YouTube videos. We read every PREA standard we can find. Department of Justice has a lot of great information. And then we compiled our own training program. So we have an internal training program that we utilize. And then I cannot give enough kudos to the prisons that we work with. I mean, it was one of the greatest, I think, brainstorming sessions I had was bringing all of those different people in. And we even had prisons that aren't on our MOU that showed up to our meet and greet as well, that offered a lot of guidance on what they wanted exactly. I would highly recommend, if anybody is going to sign an MOU, I don't know how. Oh, I just saw something pop up. Yes, TASA is Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. Yes. But I would highly recommend, if you're going to provide services to incarcerated survivors, absolutely work with your prison. I was amazed at the turnout. I mean, we had a full conference room. I'm not even in the county where these prisons are located. You know, they all drove over an hour to come to my facility. We provided lunch for them, and it was several hours of going through a presentation of what we thought we could provide to them. And then them providing us our resources, us talking about concerns both ways. You know, how do we think we could help? What are the possible outcomes or concerns that we could see out of this partnership? How can we get ahead of those? So that's the number one thing I could recommend, is absolutely work really closely with your prisons, and not just the PREA coordinators. You know, we had the wardens come out. We had several corporals and frontline prison officers come out as well. So we wanted to talk to the people that are there, you know, the officers that are working with the inmates. We wanted a full encompassing view of what y'all are experiencing and help our staff understand how we can meet these needs.
And for our last question, do you think the pandemic caused an increase or decrease in prison victimization?
I don't know. I think Mark would be a better answer for that. I didn't see it increase or really decrease. It seemed like, you know, we get a few calls. It's definitely not our biggest program. I mean, we serve so many people in the community. I wouldn't know. I'm sorry. I would love to answer that, but I would hate to give false stats on that. So I'm not too sure. We haven't served enough survivors at this point, and our program is so new that I wouldn't have any way. Mark, do you know?
Yeah, well, the COVID-19 pandemic really affected TDC in many different areas, concerning counseling, concerning programming, officer shortage. From that February 2020, for the next 10 months, to the point where they had to shut and close down facilities, which the side repercussions is mean clients are going to be in their cell 22 hours every day, which means they're going to feel dehumanized, desensitized, and rational thinking. So it affected us, yes, tremendously. I mean, 5,500 to 8,000 state officers short. The labor market was affected, employees leaving and they changing their whole lifestyle because of COVID, not wanting to come back to work.
Thank you for chiming in on that, Mark.
Oh, yes.
And thank you all for those great questions from our audience members and for all of your responses, Kelly. And I do, again, want to thank you for the work that you do and for the people at the Crisis Center who help individuals who are incarcerated.
Now on to our next presenter, Dr. Bree Beaupre, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Victim Studies here at Sam Houston.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining us for this very important panel. I'm going to be talking about victimization under custody broadly. So I'll talk a little bit about myself to get started. My name is Bree. I am an assistant professor here at Sam Houston State University in the Department of Victim Studies. This is my dog, Alfie. You might see him roaming around in the background. But my research area is really focused on the impacts of incarceration, and specifically those impacts on families. So I do not directly research prison victimization, but it is adjacently very much involved in what I do. So this presentation today is not necessarily going to be my personal research. I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what we're dealing with in our US correctional system and the implications of that for people who are incarcerated. And so I pull a lot from what I teach. I teach violence against women. I teach transformative justice. So some of these slides, if you're a student in my class, they might be familiar, but this is very much, related to what I teach. So I'm really excited to share this with you all. And in the spirit of the way that I teach, I'm also going to make this interactive and ask you questions to answer in the chat. And since I know a lot of you are students, I know that some of you might be familiar with this material and will have some background knowledge and can participate and answer the questions. And so with that, I have my first question for you to answer in the chat. How many people are incarcerated in the US? What is the number of people incarcerated in the United States? And you can guess, it's not a quiz. I won't grade you, don't worry. 10 million, 1.8 million, 2 million. See, I'm asking the crowd that knows the answers. 3 million, 1.9, good. All right, perfect. Thank you for answering. About 2 million. Great. So now I'm going to reveal to you the answer. So the US is the world leader in incarceration. We incarcerate people at a higher rate than any other nation in the world. So we incarcerate people at a rate of 655 per 100,000. And so we represent about 5% of the world's general population, but 25% of the world's prison population. So that is a huge amount. We're known as the world leader in a lot of things. And the reality is that we're also the world leader in locking people up. And in particular, the US prison population increased 750% from the early 1970s through the early 2000s. And can anyone guess what caused that increase, that huge spike, particularly around the late 70s, 80s, and 90s? What was going on during then? Why did we see this increase? Yay, great job, Kelsey. The war on drugs, yes, the war on drugs was a big part of it. Also, the Get Tough on Crime movement in general. We increased the net for who could be sent to prison, and it widened the net, especially for people convicted of nonviolent offenses, but also increased penalties for violent offenses as well. So we saw really strict sentencing and tough laws all across the board. And so just to give you a background, I know a lot of you here are familiar with the correctional system, but just in case if you're not, there are different supervision types. So when we talk about jail and prison, that's referring to institutional settings. And when we have probation and parole, that's referring to community settings. And so that's how we distinguish the two. So when I refer to people who are incarcerated or imprisoned, that's referring to people that are housed and detained. They cannot leave. So I just wanted to let you know that. And so as of 2020, to answer your question, which many of you got right, there are 1.8 million people incarcerated in the US. So good job. Many of you got the answer correct. There are an additional 3.9 million people on probation and more than 850,000 on parole. And in total, nearly 7 million Americans are under correctional supervision, and that is separate from detainment centers and things like that. So we have a lot of people who are locked up. And as a note, we also have nearly 50,000 youth held in facilities across the US as well. But yes, it's over 2% of the entire US population. Yes, great point, Dr. DeMello. And so the likelihood of incarceration varies across race and gender as well. It's not an equal likelihood. So of all men, 1 in 9 men will at some point be incarcerated in their lives. And for women, that statistic is 1 in 56. But when we break this out by racial subgroups, we see intersectional differences. And so for white men, the odds are 1 in 17. For white women, the odds are 1 in 111. But for Black men, the odds are 1 in 3, which is huge. That's a huge disparity. And for Black women, the odds are 1 in 18. And for Latino men, the odds are 1 in 6. And for Latino women, the odds are 1 in 45. So we see that people of color, namely Black and Latinx people, are overrepresented in the US prison population. And also of note, LGBTQ people face increased risk for system involvement. So LGBTQ youth in particular are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. They comprise 9.5% of youth in custody versus 9.5% of youth in the general population versus 20% of youth in custody. So that's a large disparity as well. And lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are incarcerated at a rate 3 times the rate of straight people. So that is also a huge disparity. And BIPOC transgender people have an especially high risk of lifetime rates of incarceration. So this is talking about multiplicative marginalization. If you are marginalized sexually and by race, your odds of incarceration are even greater. And so this is all important to keep in mind because this increases your risk for becoming victimized in prison as well. So I have another question for you in the chat. What % of people are incarcerated for violent offenses? What % of people in prison are there for violent offenses? 40%. Good guess. Solid. 30%, 10%. Good, good. Okay. All right, so let's reveal the answer. So it varies by type of facility, but for state prisons, 55% are incarcerated for violent offenses, but in federal prisons, only 6% are incarcerated for violent offenses. So it really depends on the type of facility. But as a whole, we have a lot of individuals who are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, largely drug and property related offenses. And so what about Texas? What's going on in our state? So here's my next question for you. How many people are incarcerated in Texas? What is the number of people locked up here in our state? Answer in the chat, please. What do you think? 130,000, solid. Kelsey, I feel like you have researched these facts fairly recently. You are getting them. Awesome. Great. These are great guesses. Oh, nice. Cool. Okay, so let's see the real amount. So as a whole, we have about 250,000 people in Texas who are locked up, and the majority of them are incarcerated in state prisons. So that means that Texas houses 14% of our prison population in the US, and we have 8% of the US general population. So we have a large number of people incarcerated in our state. And in fact, we have the 10th highest incarceration rate in the nation. So we incarcerate people at a higher rate than the national average. We have 840 per 100,000. So yay, Texas. I don't know if that's a yay. That's not really the greatest thing to be known for, but that is the current status in our state. And so something that I'd also like to highlight is that what happens to people while they're incarcerated also impacts their family members. And so I'm going to ask you another question in the chat. What % of people in the US have had a loved one incarcerated? What % of people in the US have had a loved one incarcerated? Too many is accurate. Yes. Lucy brought up that many people are awaiting trial in jail. Yes, that is very true. On average in the nation, 75% of people in jail have not even been convicted of a crime yet, and they're awaiting trial. So we've got a wide range. We've got 60%, 33%, 45, 50 for our guesses for what percent have had a loved one incarcerated. The answer is actually about 45% of people in the US have had a family member incarcerated. And that means that 1 in 2 adults in the US has had an immediate family member incarcerated at some point in their lives. Yes, Dr. Clevenger, it is a wow. It's a lot. It's a very pervasive issue that impacts not only incarcerated people, but their loved ones. And so I share that because I was actually one of those people. Both my parents were incarcerated for most of my life, my young adulthood and childhood. And my dad in particular was incarcerated in facilities all across the state of Nevada. And so this is this is from the visitation rooms all across those prisons. And so I wanted to share that because I wanted to give some personal relevance about why this topic is important to me. A lot of times it's left to families to advocate for their loved ones. And my dad is actually here watching this presentation. His name is Scott, who just said hi in the chat. So he's here watching. He has since been released. He's been out for about 10 years, over 10 years. And so, you know, this has had a big impact on my life, seeing the experiences with him and a lot of the lack of transparency that occurs in correctional agencies. A lot of what occurs is out of sight, out of mind. Prisons are symbolically located outside of our community, and there's not a ton of external oversight and transparency about what goes on in these facilities. And so that's why it's been like my life mission to use my research and scholarship to learn about what does occur and to reveal a lot of the injustices that occur behind bars. And also, I bring this up because a lot of times in the media and pop culture, we joke about prison rape and prison sexual assault. So this is actually from a clip from SpongeBob, a cartoon for children that's making a joke about don't drop the soap. So this is really pervasive, and it's a huge issue that we're making light of something that is so serious and that impacts people who are incarcerated. And so this is why I'm here today, is to really emphasize the importance and the seriousness of this issue. That's not something that we should be making fun of or making light of. And so with that, I'd like to start with the prevalence of victimization. So I'm actually going to take a step back and start with when people enter custody. And so I found some pretty terrifying statistics about victimization in custody, starting with police, that I found when I was compiling my modules for violence against women. And so that's why I wanted to share this, because incarceration or being under custody starts with police, being in their custody. And so over the past years, we've seen an increase in women experiencing police use of force. That's risen dramatically since 1999 to 2015. And so it's increased 353% for women. So that is a huge issue that is impacting, having gendered contexts across the use of force. And of note, sexual misconduct is actually the second most commonly reported type of misconduct. And so largely this is impacting women. And so this is a huge issue that we need more awareness and activism towards. And nearly 1,000 police officers nationwide have lost their licenses as a result of sexual violence allegations. So again, this is a huge issue. It is also largely underreported. These statistics are probably much lower than what actually occurs. And also only 35 states, there are 35 states that do not explicitly prohibit police officers from having sexual contact with people in their custody. So only 35 states do not have any laws against that, which is a little startling to me. And so now I'm going to talk about what we typically think of as in custody, which is prisons, jails. And so here are some broad figures. Estimating the actual numbers is difficult because it is largely underreported, and I'll talk about why that is. As a whole, even the community victimization is largely underreported, and even more so when we're talking about in custody. But here's what we do know from the Prison Policy Initiative. So these are just the number of deaths by suicide and homicide. This is the most recent statistics we have in 2016. So deaths by homicide, there were 95 in 2016 in federal prisons and in state prisons. And intentionally injured by staff was reported that about 15% of incarcerated people in 2004 and 8.3% of incarcerated people in 2004 experienced this across different prison types. Staff on incarcerated people's assaults, that was 21% of incarcerated men were assaulted by staff over 6 months in 2005. For those incarcerated among each other, there were a total of 26,000 assaults in 2005. And incidence of sexual victimization of incarcerated people really varies across the institutional type. So in state prisons, there were about 17,000 reported incidents. In federal prisons, there were about 740. There are far less federal prisons, so that is part of why. And 1,400 were substantiated incidents, which means that there was, a finished result. There was I don't want to say reconciliation, but there was some sort of, that claim was substantiated and proven those allegations were true. So a lot of them go unsubstantiated. And people in prison experience physical and sexual violence behind bars at alarmingly high rates. So for men, physical victimization is higher. About 35% of incarcerated people reported physical victimization versus 24% of women incarcerated. And for sexual victimization, it's the opposite. Women are more likely to experience this. So 25% of women versus 10% of men. And this is, again, also reported. These numbers could be much different if we're talking about unreported. And so I wanted to give a quote from some qualitative research that kind of will give you an idea of what incarcerated people experience when they're behind bars. And so, I'm sure you've seen from movies and TV shows that it is typically a very violent and conflictual place behind bars. And that is very much the case. That's what we see from qualitative research as well. And so this is a quote from an incarcerated man. So people fight every day. Every day. You go a day, there's a fight. It's like you're gonna see a fight, okay? Every day it's a fight. It's a fight every 10 or 20 minutes. And so this is what these individuals are encountering. Like, we talk a lot about sexual victimization, but there's also physical violence everywhere in prison. And so this is like a constant state of unrest that people have to deal with. And it depends on the institution and the facility. If it's, higher or lower custody, that affects things. It also affects how old people are in prison. Typically, if it's an older population, there's less of this because they're more settled into their sentence and there's less, but it's still a pervasive issue that people encounter when they're incarcerated. And allegations of sexual victimization have tripled from 2011 to 2015. So in 2015, there were about 25,000 allegations of sexual victimization, which is a huge number. And so I have a question for y'all in the chat. What % of those sexual misconducts are committed by staff? What % do you think are committed by staff versus other incarcerated inmates? People, sorry, I tried very hard to use person-centered language. Okay, 10%, 25%, 5%. Okay, I'm gonna tell you, you're all guessing very low here, which is going to surprise you. I think the real number, 3%. Okay, so the percent of sexual misconducts is 49%. From this Bureau of Justice Statistics report. 49%, yes, OMG, Dr. DeMello. 49%. So nearly half of these sexual misconducts are committed by staff. And then I have another question for you in the chat, especially those who work in the system. You may know this answer from your PREA training. What groups are most vulnerable for or at risk for victimization while in custody? Yep, LGBTQ plus people. Yep, great. Children, those with mental illness. Yep. Yep, good, good. Women, yep. Great. Awesome. So most of you got the answers right. Those committed of sexual offenses are not quite on the list. I think they might be more at risk for physical victimization, and other panelists can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is specifically for sexual victimization. So the vulnerable populations that we typically identify are youth or children who are incarcerated, women, those who have already been victimized, you're more likely to become victimized again, LGBTQ plus people, and those with diminished mental or physical capabilities. So that could include people like those who are elderly. And so nearly half of youth sexual victimizations are committed by staff, so 45%. So 9% of all incarcerated youth experience some form of victimization while they're incarcerated. And of note, of these individuals who are victimized by staff, 30% of them are victimized by more than one staff member. That statistic really shocked me, that it's multiple staff members victimizing the same youth. So yes, wow again. Yeah. And 1 in 3 of those who have been victimized through sexually abusive contact were women. So 1 in 3. And this is an important thing to note because women only comprise about 10% of the prison population, but they're representing about 1/3 of these sexual misconducts. And so that is an overrepresentation. They're at increased risk for sexual violence. And if you are ever interested in the experiences of women in prison, particularly related to victimization, I highly recommend this book. It's called Inside This Place, Not of It. We read this book in my violence against women class because it covers women's pathways that are often characterized by victimization and abuse, and also the horrific experiences they have while they're in prison. What % of staff members who commit these crimes are sent to jail and prison? That is an excellent question that I do not know the answer to. I have some information later in the presentation about resolutions broadly, but that is an excellent question. And I would love to know the answer to it. Okay, so also LGBTQ individuals are more likely to be victimized once they are incarcerated. So this is 5.4% of LGBTQ individuals, LGB individuals who are victimized by staff, and also 12% victimized by another person. And yes, it definitely goes highly unreported, and we'll talk about why. So I actually wanted to share some infographics that my students made. So in my classes, I asked students to make infographics about social issues. And this was just last week. One of my students, Santana Espinoza, posted this on our Discord discussion. And I really thought it highlighted these issues. So LGBT men and women are 10 times as likely to be sexually victimized by another incarcerated person, and 2.6 times as likely to be incarcerated or to be victimized by staff. So this highlights, the realities of LGBT people in particular who are incarcerated. And then I also really liked this infographic, which is building awareness about trans people who are incarcerated. So they're 10 times more likely to be assaulted while incarcerated. That's a huge amount. And so this was by a student, Mason Zunker, who created this really great infographic. So I wanted to share those as well. Oh, I was talking more about how many prison staff members who are reported. Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. And the answer is also that I do not know, but I would like to know. Are there support services for transgender incarcerated people in Texas? That's also a great question, which I do not have the answer to. Okay, so let's look briefly at Texas. So 5 Texas prisons had rates of sexual victimization more than double the national average. So that was pretty alarming to me. And the Prison Justice League and the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault did a survey with people who reported sexual abuse in prison, and they found out that 59% were assaulted by a staff member, and 41% of respondents identified as LGBTQ. So we're seeing some of the same patterns in Texas as well. But of note, jail and prison is rarely the first place that these people experience violence. The majority of incarcerated people have histories of emotional, sexual, and physical abuse. So we call this the victimization offending overlap. Those who are victimized often offend. I don't want to say, I'm sorry, that was worded wrong. There is a overlap between those who have been victimized and those who offend later on. And this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about people's pathways and keeping them out of the system. And I think we need to remember that, this line is really blurred. And at the end of the day, these are human beings who have gone through trauma and victimization throughout their lives. And so reporting victimization, a lot of things can prevent this, largely stigma, shame, and fear. And so these are some quotes from some qualitative research about the context of police misconduct. I didn't think that anyone would believe me. I feel like all the police will work together. What's the good of telling the police? What kind of police do you call on the police? Which is a fair question. So that's why it's really important to have external resources and things like the crisis center. And so according to that report I mentioned earlier, of those people who were surveyed, there was not a single instance of a successful investigation or a favorable outcome, which is also really shocking. And 82% of those respondents reported retaliation from either prison staff or other incarcerated people after reporting. And so this is one quote from that study. I'm harassed every day by staff and incarcerated people because I reported being raped. This is why so many people on the Estelle unit refuse to report being sexually assaulted. They know they will be punished, not treated as a victim. And so, as mentioned by previous panelists, there's this punishment of the vulnerable, that those who are reporting are actually placed in administrative segregation or protective custody, but that's basically solitary confinement. And LGBTQ people are disproportionately placed in solitary. So I know I'm running a bit late on time, but I really would love to show this video. It's not very long, and it shows what LGBTQ people and those who are victimized go through while incarcerated. So I promise it'll be worth it. It might cut into the Q&A. I'm sorry.
When I was 12 years old, I got into a food fight. They charged me with assault, and I got 3 years for that. I was on a 9-day observation in the California Youth Authority reception. And within that 90-day period, I was raped by a young person, 16 years old. That I felt such a deep depression that even though I had to go to the bathroom, I didn't want to get up. You have people that are going through mental anguish. You have people that are LGBTQ that are hurting. And when they're victimized, and then you place them in solitary confinement, what you're doing essentially is throwing away the key. You're throwing away the key to their well-being. And if you're not strong, they can end up taking their lives, killing themselves. And that's what's so hateful about the system.
So yeah, I wanted to share that video. It's really powerful. I show it in my classes often. So I'm going to quickly wrap up through the rest of these slides. I'll go quickly. So some research has found that less than a quarter of incarcerated people who were victimized received counseling or mental health services. And this just goes to this concept of systemic trauma, which is basically asserting that the contextual factors or features of an environment or institutions can actually exacerbate or give rise to trauma, maintain it, and also impact post-traumatic stress responses. And so when we think of a prison, right, like these individuals who are incarcerated have already experienced a great deal of victimization and trauma in their lives. And now we're putting them in another traumatic environment. It's not really conducive to healing and reducing harm. And so here's another quote from an incarcerated person. If I hear noises, like if I hear a noise too quick, I'll immediately get ready to strike in a defensive, violent mode. I don't know if that's institutionalized, if I'm programmed, but that's the lifestyle I had to live to stay alive in prison. And so this is the reality that impacts people who are incarcerated, and it follows them still through when they're released. And so where do we go from here? I think ultimately, you know, all of us on this call really want to stop the cycle of harm. And the reality is that our current approaches aren't necessarily achieving this goal. There are things like the Crisis Center that really give me hope, and other programs like Mr. Holmes, who talked about earlier. Those make me hopeful, but as a whole, you know, are we really intervening to stop that cycle through the criminal legal system? And the reality is that nearly all incarcerated people are eventually going to be released at some point. And so the public, including survivors, really want to improve public safety. And so what we do in prisons and jails really matters. And I know Kelly mentioned being trauma-informed or trauma-responsive. That is a big piece of this, having programming, environment, and language that acknowledges that every single person has experienced some form of trauma throughout their lives. And that includes staff as well. But as a whole, we really need more transparency. I was trying to look up statistics and figures related to Texas specifically, and I found one report. So we need a lot more information, and in particular, external research and oversight, because if you're reporting, you know, within that environment, you may fear retaliation, especially if your abuser is someone who is working in that facility. So having more external resources, I think, is key. Also having those resources focused on prevention, so preventing the victimization from occurring to begin with, I think is a big part of this. And stop the use of solitary, especially as, you know, a response to people who have been victimized. And so I'd like to leave us with this quote from Russian novelist Dostoevsky. He said that the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. So I think we really need to take a step back and consider what we are doing to those who are behind bars. And here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. Come take a class with me if you haven't already. I promise they're pretty fun. We talk about heavy topics, but we do it in an interactive and engaging way. And that is all I have.
So our first question is, are many reports of staff victimization by inmates found to be truthful?
Oh, that's a good question. So I did mention that about 25,000 reports were made in 2015, 2016, and only 1,500 were substantiated. So what exactly that means, like me as a researcher, as an external person, I'm not exactly sure. I think that maybe having a PREA representative or someone who is more in tune with, you know, what goes into the investigation might be able to give us more information. But the reality is that the most of the allegations are not substantiated.
Second question is, one of the avenues that the person was thinking about is victimization and community supervision, especially when considering lifetime supervision such as parole. Is there any specific data or research yet on this topic?
Like barely. Honestly, there's not a lot, and part of that is like accessing that information or even being able to talk to incarcerated people. I mean, I myself have submitted, you know, research proposal to talk to incarcerated people about this stuff, and it was denied by a state DOC. So getting access to that information is really hard. I think there actually might be a better likelihood in the community if you don't go through the Department of Corrections, but there definitely is a need for more research specifically in community settings. Yes.
Our next question is, what leads to disparities for LGBTQ+ and BIPOC populations?
In terms of incarceration or
Yes,
victimization?
incarceration.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a big question. Well, I think it goes to our social structures in society, and a lot of critical scholars argue that the use of incarceration as a form of social control is meant to further oppress those who are considered at the margins in society. And if those who are marginalized are seen as a threat, we may enact laws and things to incarcerate those who we see as a threat. And so that is part of it. Also for LGBTQ individuals in particular, a lot of them are at increased risk to become homeless. And we know that that is a direct pipeline to become incarcerated because in a lot of states, soliciting or just being like living on the streets is considered breaking the law. And so they can literally be incarcerated for not having a home. And so if they're at increased risk for that, it leads to just a cycle of becoming incarcerated throughout their lives. And I think ultimately it's not having the social support and resources that they need, because a lot of those resources are created and aimed towards cis, hetero, white people, and so if you're a marginalized person and those resources are not applicable or relatable to you, it's difficult to gain access. No, it's both. It's a combination of the two.
And is it common for former inmates to show symptoms of PTSD related to their incarceration?
Oh yes, definitely. And there's studies there's research about it, but there's also the one that I linked quotes from Dr. Novisky and Peralta. That study will talk about the impacts of witnessing violence every day, how that impacts a person who is incarcerated.
Okay. And someone asked about the victimization of correctional staff. So inmates outnumber staff about 50-1 and often attempt to bully or harass staff and treat them like animals, yet they often file grievances as retaliation for valid disciplinary action.
Was that a question? Sorry.
Yeah, so what about the victimization of correctional staff?
Oh, sure. So my focus is on incarcerated people. I think that information is available. Just my area of expertise is focused on the people who are incarcerated.
That's all we had for our Q&A. So we will be transitioning for one more break.
Now, without further ado, Dr. Jared DeMello in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Sam Houston State University.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So for this last presentation on the panel, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about prison gangs and victimization, specifically within the gang context. I'm super excited to be following Dr. Bapre because I think that our presentations are really going to talk to each other. In particular, she noted two things. One is that violence tends to be underreported, and also that some of our data tends to be outdated with, more recent years unavailable. And I think you're going to see that that's actually a really common trend throughout this topic because it's also very relevant to the prison gang landscape. So a little bit about me. I'm new to Sam Houston. This is my first semester. I'm super excited to have joined the Bearcat family. I was an assistant professor at another school. I also have a really cute little fur baby research assistant. She's not allowed to be running around in this room because she barks way too much, and you definitely would not be able to hear anything that I'm saying over her loud bark. But she's a wonderful research assistant. So a little bit about me. My research focuses on covert networks more broadly. So I'm interested in understanding how gangs and terrorist organizations sort of evolve within the conflict landscape. And to that end, I don't do a whole lot with prison gangs. I tend to focus more on criminal street gangs, just as of now, although I do have an interest in sort of getting into that space. So I'm going to be approaching this project, or excuse me, this presentation, really thinking about sort of the intersection of criminal street gangs and prison gangs and sort of how they connect with each other to cause victimization within the prison environment. So an overview of this presentation. So I'm going to start by talking about gangs in general, and specifically criminal street gangs, why they matter and why they matter for the purposes of our conversations of prison gangs. I'll then talk a little bit about the key players. We'll sort of break apart 6 of the most common prison gangs that are operating within the country. We'll talk a little bit about their violence and victimization due to gangs. And then I want to end sort of tying it back to the practitioner side about policy implications and what this really means as a path forward for all of us. So when we think of American street gangs, it's important to note that we actually have statutes at the federal and the state level that codify what it means to be a street gang. And notice at the federal level, they're commenting on we need to have at least 5 or more individuals involved within the association to be a gang. But at the state level, it tends to be different. So for Texas, it's 3 or more persons. Now, a lot of these definitions exist in most principalities for street gangs, but you'll notice that most jurisdictions don't actually have a technical definition of a prison gang. And I argue that that's problematic because a lot of these similar patterns, right? So having a common identifying sign, having some sort of leadership structure or hierarchy, that association mechanism, a lot of those factors that do impact street gangs also impact prison gangs. And so we really need to come up with a more effective definition. And I think what you'll see is part of the problem with reporting on prison gangs is because we don't have a solid definition to base our reporting off of. So this map is a little bit outdated. It's from 2010, but I do like to use it because it's the most recent data that we have that shows the full United States gang sort of map. And in the 12 years that have passed since this map was generated by the National Gang Intelligence Center, it's important to note that we've seen a higher level of intensity. So all of those like cream colored areas where they had just low levels of gang members, we're starting to see a lot of those move to the yellows and oranges. And some of the areas that previously weren't reporting gang activity are now reporting. So we're seeing gang activity spread throughout the country. So a question for all of you, how many gangs do you think are operating in the United States? So like the organizations, how many gangs are there in the US? What do you think? Okay, I see 50, over 1,000, 30, 200, 2,000, including the police, 300. So I think you'll be really surprised by this, but in the United States, as of 2012, there were 30,000 unique gangs. So to put this into perspective, there are 5,300 institutions of higher education in the United States. So there's about 6 gangs to every college in this country, which is crazy. But in the 10 years since this official data has been reported, the FBI actually estimates that we're now up to 33,000 gangs operating within the country. So this is a lot, right? So especially if we think of the number of people incarcerated, if we think of the overall populations of the United States, we're talking about massive numbers of organizations. So now the question is, if we know that there's 30,000 gangs, how many gang members do you think there are in the United States? Gang members. Okay, we see 1 million, 3 million, 2 million, 4 million. Yes, lots and lots of gang members. So luckily, we're not in the multi-millions yet, but as of 2012, there were 850,000 known gang individuals. But again, this comes back to what we've been talking about with some of the other presentations of those are only the known individuals. That doesn't take into account all of the individuals that are not sort of identified as gang members. Nicholas, we're actually going to talk about your question here in a little bit, because there are instances where people are sort of swapping between gangs as well. To put this into perspective, of the 850,000 individuals, that's larger than the populations of the 5 least dense states in this country. So we are still talking about massive numbers of people that are involved in gang activity. And again, this is talking mostly street gangs. And so the question that really emerges is, so what? If we're here in a webinar talking about prison gangs, why should we actually care about what's happening in the street gang landscape? And so I bring us back to sort of an academic definition of the gang that was put together by Curry, Decker, and Pyruz in their book, Confronting Gangs. And so they actually create these 6 characteristics of a gang. They say that for a street gang to be a street gang, it has to include a group, there needs to be symbols, forms of communication, there needs to be some sort of permanence or temporality, there needs a street orientation, and they have to be involved in crime. Well, if we think of the prison gangs, 5 of these 6 attributes are actually true for the prison gang. And if we look at the one that's not, that the gangs must include a street orientation, really that's just by definition, right? So if it's a prison gang, it's going to operate in the prisons instead of the streets. However, what we'll see is that many of these prison gangs are also operating outside of the prison system on the streets. And so this is important, right? Because it means that we're seeing these connections of like a theoretical connection, but also a practical connection between street and prison gangs. So when we think of prison gangs, we are still thinking criminal organizations, but think criminal organizations that are originating specifically within the penal system, but those that also continue to operate within the correctional facilities. And so ultimately, this creates this like self-perpetuating cycle where criminal entities are operating within the prison system, but then it's moving outside, right? So as individuals who were gang affiliated are released from prison, we see that that violence is exported out into general society and the broader communities. But it's also a cyclical system. We see individuals who are involved in gang activity out on the streets who then move into the criminal justice system, and then they get involved with these prison gangs as well. In terms of organization, we see a lot of variability across gangs. So some of the gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood and La Nuestra Familia, are very highly structured. They have a designated leadership command and control system where it's very clear who the leaders are, who like sort of the mid-level managers are, and who sort of the frontline workers are. Other groups like the Mexican Mafia or La M tend to be less formalized. They're more based off of association rather than like the business model of hierarchy. But I think what's really important is that in general, these groups tend to have fewer members than street gangs and outlaw motorcycles. So we're looking at smaller populations, but the prison gangs are primarily structured along racial or ethnic lines. So when we're looking at violence for street gangs, which I do a lot in my research, we'll see a lot of mixing between races and ethnicities for specific gangs. But within these prison gangs, they tend to be very, very segregated by racial or ethnic ties. Okay, so these are 6 of the most active prison gangs operating within the United States today. And so we're going to go through and sort of talk about each one. And I tried to pull like 1 or 2 sort of really interesting facts, or what I thought was an interesting fact for each gang. But note some of the similarities that we're seeing here, because realistically, a lot of the groups that are coming into existence, specifically for prisons, do have some common themes. So the Aryan Brotherhood is a white supremacist group. It was started in the San Quentin prison in California in 1967. And in terms of initiation, it's really a referral-based system. So a current member will say, you know, I'd like to recommend so-and-so for joining the group. Maybe they've engaged in some activities outside of prison, maybe some of their cred within the prison system. For whatever reason, I'd like to nominate them. And once they're nominated, As long as they make a lifelong commitment, they're accepted to the Aryan Brotherhood. Now, what's important here is there's no mechanism to formally leave the Brotherhood. The idea is once you join, you're in it for life. In a 10-year reporting window that California released statistics on from 1975 to 1985, California identified 40 homicides that were committed by members of the Brotherhood. And these were perpetrated against other incarcerated persons, but also staff members. And this is important because some of the prison gangs really focus on the pecking order, if you will, or like the social structure where they wanted to be the top of the incarcerated social hierarchy. Whereas the Aryan Brotherhood is not afraid to push back, and they're not afraid to engage in violence against staff members or sort of beyond just the scope of other incarcerated individuals, which makes them dangerous for a lot of prison staff. And a part of that ties back to their sort of financial goals. So the Aryan Brotherhood, especially within the prison system, is really oriented around their financial means. And they do that primarily through the distribution of contraband, notably drugs on cell phones throughout the prison system of the United States. So the converse side of this would actually be the Black Guerrilla family, which was also started in San Quentin in the 60s. But their membership is comprised of Black or African-American males. And what I think is really interesting about BGF is instead of doing a nomination process, they really look for individuals who were already gang members associated with street gangs, who are now in the prison system and trying to recruit that way. And to some degree, this sort of shows like the commitment to the gang lifestyle, right? So the Black Guerrilla family's members are really people who are a little bit more seasoned with the gang lifestyle. And so the idea is there's a little bit more sort of more wherewithal and a little bit more decision-making and strategy that could go into place. This group is a huge concern to law enforcement in particular, because their goal is actually to overthrow the United States government. We see a lot of connections to sort of these like anarchy movements and these like conspiracy theories with the Black Guerrilla family. So they are very, very dangerous to law enforcement and political officials, and the threat of violence towards these populations are very high. The Black Guerrilla family is allied with the La Nuestra Familia gang, which we'll also talk about. But they are actually rivals against the Brotherhood and Mexican Mafia. So we're really sort of seeing how these 6 key groups are sort of building these alliance structures for violence and partnerships within. Excuse me. So the next 3 groups are all Hispanic gangs. La Nuestra Familia, also in California in the 1960s, noticing a trend from California. La Nuestra Familia really is trying to focus on protecting younger individuals and specifically rural Mexican inmates. And they're actually trying to protect them from another gang, the Mexican Mafia, who was targeting other Mexican inmates within the prison system. What I think is really fascinating about La Nuestra Familia is that the street version and the prison version have very different organizational chains of command. One is very hierarchical and the other is very loose and based off association. There is a life membership like the other 2 groups we talked about, but La Nuestra Familia has a specific clause that says if you're joining us, if you're joining the family, if you will, you have to pledge to join the street gang version if you're released from incarceration. And so the idea is like, if you leave the prison system, if you're fortunate enough to leave, you really need to take our fight out to the streets and continue the fight and make sure that our mission is also being accomplished out in society. And so this is sort of in direct competition with the Mexican Mafia, which was started a bit earlier at a Center for Troubled Youth, also in California. And so the Mexican Mafia doesn't necessarily have to be comprised of Mexicans, but also Mexican Americans and Hispanics more broadly. The Mafia, I think, is very interesting because for this group, females also play a really important role. So wives and girlfriends, sisters, they're actually like the key within the Mexican mafia's drug distribution scene. And oftentimes they're the ones who are helping smuggle in the contraband into the prisons. The Mexican mafia is extremely, extremely violent. We know that they will murder as a way to gain respect. They'll murder as a way of retaliation, and it is a huge, huge concern. DPS actually lists the Mexican mafia as a level 1 threat to community security in Texas in their sort of annual gangs report. Huge concern in the prison system, huge concern also in in our local communities. The netas are originated in Puerto Rico, so not California, and they also originated a lot later than some of the other gangs we're talking about. And I think that they're really interesting because they almost came into existence as a mutual protection group. So their goal was to sort of help protect individuals from some of the other abuses that were occurring by guards and other prisoners. And so I think this ties nicely with what Dr. Bakre was talking about sort of this high level of victimization that's not really being reported. And so this is sort of the byproduct of that, where the gang said, you know, if there's no institutional mechanism to protect us, we'll come into an existence and we'll protect each other. The netas do have an established hierarchical structure. And I think it's really neat. So each chapter has these like designated leadership positions, the president, the vice president, the treasurer. And it's through an election process. So all gang members for like a specific chapter or a specific facility would actually engage in elections for who they want the president or vice president to be for that term. In Puerto Rico, the netas are exclusively in the prison system, but in the United States, we see them both in prisons and communities, particularly communities in the Northeast. And so the last group I'd like to talk about is the Texas Syndicate, because of course we're here in Texas. But you'll be interested to know they were actually not founded in Texas. The Texas Syndicate is a California-based prison gang, but it was a direct response to some of those other gangs that we've talked about, most importantly, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia. And what they saw was that some of those other California gangs were really bullying or preying on some native Texas inmates. And we know from our last presentation that Texas disproportionately incarcerates individuals. And so this group sort of came into existence of, you know, what about us and how do we sort of push back and protect Texans? And so we saw the rise of the Texas Syndicate, which is also listed as a level 1 threat by DPS. Now, something that I find really interesting about the Texas Syndicate is that they actually have a constitution that they require the members to abide by. They say members need to be a Texan. You have to always remain a member, so similar to some of the other gangs. But they also say the syndicate comes above all else. The syndicate is always right. If there's ever a conflict between the syndicate and what other entities like the prison system's telling you, the syndicate is correct. They make it very clear of there has to be a tattoo. You need to support one another, respect one another, and ultimately all information needs to stick with the gang. So that sort of ties back to that first presentation of, you know, snitches get stitches. And so when we look at this, if we look at some of these gangs operating within Texas, just to compare the two, so if we look at the syndicate and the Mexican Mafia, both of them are organized based off of a paramilitary structure. However, the Texas Syndicate really uses democratic leadership, right? That voting process, whereas the Mexican Mafia is more militaristic in the sense of the lieutenants will order individuals to do something rather than ask for collective input. And when it comes to sort of how they come into an existence, for the Texas Syndicate, there's a comprehensive process that's very lengthy. It's a recruiting process. There's a vetting process. Whereas the Mexican Mafia says, you know, any Hispanic inmate who has a friend who's an active member who can vouch for them, you're welcome to join us. So the QR code actually takes us to a 1990 NIJ report that's specifically sort of looking at these two specific gangs. So ultimately, the question becomes, is the prison gang the hidden linchpin within the illicit network landscape? So we know that prison gangs pose a national threat because of their role that they play in the transportation and distribution of narcotics, as well as the broader drug trade outside of prisons. We also know that prison gangs really serve as sort of the coordinator and brokers between the drug trafficking organizations and the street gangs that tend to spread the drugs throughout the United States. And this actually is really salient in the Northeast, where we see like the drug trafficking organizations based out of Hartford, Connecticut, and the gangs that actually take those drugs and move them all the way up to the Canadian border. We also know that prison gangs typically are more powerful within state correctional facilities rather than within the federal penal system. So at the state level, we're seeing a lot more of these effects. However, every so often, we do see salient spikes in prison gang activity within the federal level. So when it comes to violence in prisons, ultimately the motivations of these prison gangs are twofold. One is to make money, and the other is because of a power struggle. They want to be at the lead of the institution's hierarchy, right? So the top of that pecking order. And so these are really what drives violence more often than not. A lot of research has found that prison gangs tend to perpetuate the majority of violence within the prisons. So some of the other talks mentioned about victimization in general. But when we're talking about violent activities and crimes against persons, crimes against property, a lot of that is disproportionately conducted by prison gangs based off the research. It's also important to note that we see turf wars within the prison gang landscape too. And while it's a little different than the street gang landscape, we do see that certain gangs will sort of try to dominate like the rec yard or the cafeteria spaces. Something that is a little bit unique to the prison landscape is there's not really a safe space to retreat to. So like in the street gangs, they have like their safe havens that we don't really have based off of the way prisons are structured. And that's why we tend to see some of these spaces to be ethnically separated for certain facilities. When it comes to victimization, it's important to know that gang members themselves are more likely to be victimized than their non-gang counterparts, but also there's just different attributes. So gang members are more likely to be alone or under the influence of some sort of substance when they are victimized. But also, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in this space, and there's a lot of innovative work that's currently ongoing. So Chantel Fahmy, for example, in 2020 did a really interesting study where she was able to tie gang membership to higher levels and higher probabilities of head injuries within the prison system. And so I mentioned that prison gangs tend to be more salient at the state level. But this is actually an example from earlier this year in February, where all federal prisons in the United States went into a lockdown after a fight between gang members here in Texas. And so there are significant impacts, right? So like this fights between gang members here, 2 individuals died, but it caused a nationwide lockdown. So there are a lot of considerations, and it really sort of impacts the justice system more broadly. So let's talk about the broader context. And so for this, I really oriented around this 1985 NIJ study. And you might be asking, Jared, why are you giving us a study that's almost 40 years old? And it's because if we look at these recommendations, many of these recommendations still haven't actually been enforced or put into place systematically. And so this study actually found that no prison system methodically identifies, tracks, or maintains ongoing intelligence for prison gangs. And they recommended that there should be a development of a policy position on prison gangs and procedures for detecting early signs of gang activity. They recommended that one way to sort of address this problem is to have smaller prison facilities and to just reduce our overall prison population. They recommended that we establish prison gang task forces to sort of parallel like the street gang task forces that we see sort of popping up all over the country. And then they said a systematic debriefing of former gang members to obtain useful information. And I think what's really important here is this 4th recommendation really talks to a connection between the academic and practitioner worlds. And so if you're looking for a good read, there's this book called Competing for Control by David Peruz and Scott Decker. I highly recommend it. So they actually interviewed 800 incarcerated individuals in 2 Texas facilities. And they really sort of tell this narrative of how prisons sort of operate within the social order. How prison gangs operate within the social order within prisons. So ultimately, where do we go from here? A lot of further research is still needed. There's a lot of unknowns, and a lot of those unknowns are tied to the fact that data and systematic data and data that's reliable is hard to come by when we're focusing on prison gangs. So there's a lot of work in that area, but also there's a lot of scholars who are really active and really excited and really passionate to delve into these issues and sort of find answers to these questions. We do need stronger partnerships between the various components of the criminal justice system. So some of my research for different states has really commented on how there's a disconnect between policing and courts and corrections. And we need to work to sort of streamline those processes and those different parts of our system as it pertains to gang violence. And ultimately, we need to establish stronger academic partnerships. So we need to tie the scholarly knowledge with practitioner like frontline experiences to come up with data-driven solutions that are more effective to gang violence. So thank you so much. I saw that there are a lot of comments in the chat, and I look forward to sort of having those conversations. So thank you.
Such an interesting and informative presentation, Dr. DeMello. So now I'll go ahead and start asking the questions for the Q&A. So up first, what would be considered a success when it comes to gangs in America? 100% elimination doesn't seem feasible. Would a compromise be eliminating non-gang member casualties and just allowing gang members to attack each other, or is there another metric use we can use?
Yeah, so Nicholas, that's a great question. And so I don't necessarily have an answer to the main question on what would be considered a success. I mean, I think in an ideal world, all of us in criminal justice would say that, you know, abolishing all crime. But you're right, that's not really feasible. I think for me, just sort of looking at the data and looking at all of these initiatives that we've put into place, really not having having a major effect on the number of gangs or the number of gang members. I think for me, what would be considered a success is if we can have some sort of policy where we start to see a decline in the number of gangs and the number of gang members. And that could be a lot of different things. So I know some jurisdictions have had some success by implementing after-school funding so that juveniles and kids have some sort of like positive reinforcement where they could go to art club or robotics club or science club after school, and they're with like peers in a pro-social environment, as opposed to, you know, having nothing to do and getting involved with some of these organizations. But I think it really depends. I think it depends on the organization, and I think it depends on what our ultimate goals are in terms of how we want to target gang violence. And you mentioned, would a compromise be eliminating non-gang member casualties and just allowing gang members to only attack each other? Maybe. So there's a project I worked on out of California. It was led by Gisela Bickler at California State University, San Bernardino, and it was published in Crime and Delinquency. And what's really interesting about it is the project looked at civil gang injunctions. And so we used social network analysis to sort of understand, does a civil gang injunction stop the violent spread? And what we found is civil gang injunctions were actually terrible because after the injunction was put into place, not only were gangs attacking each other more, but they were also attacking the community in even greater detail. So maybe that is to your point of if we can just get rid of the community elements, that might be a solution, because then it's crime on crime. But the problem is that there is a lot of spillover, right? So something that we run into with my research and my research team deals with a lot is, where does the line of gang end and community begin? Because there's a lot of gray areas. So there's a lot of individuals who are sort of gang adjacent or gang affiliated, right? Because if you have, you know, someone whose child joined a gang, are they considered community? Are they considered gang? Because they're sort of connected through their child, but not really. And we see that a lot too of, my spouse or my brother, my sister, my parents are involved in a gang. And so it makes it a little difficult to sort of disaggregate where gang starts and community ends. So I think you ask really good questions. I think you ask really important questions. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think that this is why it's really important for us to continue investigating gangs and learning more about them.
So the next question is, are most victims of prison gangs their own members?
So I don't have a terribly strong empirical justification for this. A lot of the anecdotes that I've seen have been inner gang rivalries, specifically one gang attacking another gang's members, either based off ethnicity or based off of some sort of violation of the pecking order. So sort of encroaching on their gang turf, or a lot of the reports that I've seen have been one gang has tried to sort of take away the financial incentives of the other by getting involved within the gang landscape, within the drug landscape or the contraband scene. So I'm not really sure on the numbers though, so I can't tell you exactly how many are from their own gang versus other gangs. But it wouldn't surprise me though.
The next question is, why does there seem to be a higher rate of Hispanic type gangs when Hispanics are not the highest incarcerated race?
That's a good question. And actually that's something that I'm looking into for the street gang components at the moment in Texas. I don't have an answer at the moment, but it's something that I'm very curious about, because if you look at the total number of gangs operating within most jurisdictions, we do see higher levels of Hispanic and African American gangs in almost every part of the United States. And I think that that's something interesting that's worth pursuing. I hope to have an answer for you, Heather, in a couple of years once this current project gets a little bit further. But as of right now, I'm not really sure.
The next question is, if a non-affiliated gang member goes to prison, is it practical to serve your time in peace, or do you have to align with a group for protection?
That's a really great question. And I think that's an important question, Nicholas, because I think that's something that appears a lot. And like Dr. Bopre mentioned about some of these rape myths are sort of the serious actions that are made more comical in movies. We see this a lot too in the sort of public discourse and public conversations. I think it depends. I think it really depends on the individual. I think it depends on the risk factors of the individual. So I know that Dr. Bopre put up those statistics of, sort of based off race or based off other characteristics, the likelihood of being victimized. And so I think it really depends. So some individuals may feel that they have protection from the gangs, and so that they want to sort of adapt that way. Because remember, some of those prison gangs really came into existence with the goal of countering against other gangs. So they may feel like there's strength in numbers. But it's also risky, because knowing that these gangs are engaging in attacking behaviors against one another, it may be safer to try and stay out of it. Something that I don't have a strong pulse on yet is if you are from a specific ethnic group that has a representation in a gang, I don't know the feasibility of staying out of it versus what if someone just sort of accuses you of being in the gang. And I think that's something that needs a little bit more sort of digging. But I believe that Pyrus and Decker in their book, Competing for Control, actually covered it a little bit. I'm just not remembering the details exactly on what they came up with.
Where does Tango Blast fall in the organized gangs? And then another person commented that Tango Blast is very prevalent in this area. They have approximately 19,000 members in Texas.
Yeah, so Tango Blast is also considered a level 1 threat by DPS in the sort of like Texas-wide assessment of gang violence. But Rakesh brings up a good point that TDCJ actually classifies Tango Blast as a clique of another gang. And that's one of the things when I presented that statistic of about 30,000 gangs in 2012 and roughly 33,000 gangs now, we really need to think about how many gangs are unique from one another and how many are cliques or subsets of other gangs. And so I think that if we think about Tango Blast as a separate organization with a separate like hierarchical structure, I think that we would see them as very prominent. I mean, we would see them sort of on this list of like most active gangs. However, Tango Blast, because of their associations and sort of the way that they operate and the way that their leadership sort of yields to other groups, it makes more sense to think of them as a subgroup as opposed to their own like unique gang category. And I think that this is important because it comes down to how TDCJ, how the courts, and how law enforcement will actually sort of think about and charge these different gangs, right? Because in addition to different states having different statutes and different policies, sometimes there's very different rules for specific gangs. So like we know that the FBI will sort of create this list of, in this area, here's the target gangs that we're really interested in sort of weeding out. And so they'll focus their federal efforts on these like mass indictments of those particular gangs. And so sort of this definition, and it comes back to why we really need to establish a prison gangs definition, is if Tango Blast is being considered a clique, it may sort of fall under different rules based off of like the priority list of law enforcement. Sorry, I talk a lot, so also feel free to just cut me off at any point to move on to another question. Feel free, Alyssa.
No problem. So I'll just ask one more question. It
Sure.
seems that many of the gangs are coming out of the prison system that does not protect the incarcerated people. Do other countries have the same amount of gangs to inmate ratio?
You know, that's a great question, Beth. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head on the ratios. I do know that prison gangs aren't unique to the United States. They are all over the world. There's been some really interesting research. The name's totally escaping me right now, but if you email me, I can actually search for it. But there's been some interesting research out of Europe. And then also some of the Asian countries, I've seen a couple of articles looking at that as well. But I think you prove a good point though, of in the United States, really like we have an obligation, right, to protect all individuals. And there is this disconnect here. The fact that prison gangs have so much influence and so much power within our like penal system is problematic because it means that we are failing at an institutional level to protect those who are incarcerated. And I see it almost as a disconnect because, you know, like if we want to do research with an incarcerated population, there's extra protocols for the IRB to really ensure that, you know, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice are in place. But we need to make sure also from the institutional side that they're protected from other means, you know, how do we protect these individuals from gang violence and gang activity and being victimized more broadly? And I think that's why this panel as a whole is really important because all of the different presentations have really talked about the central theme that you're mentioning of we're failing in our responsibility for a very susceptible population. And really, we just need to do better. But I would also open it up to some of the other panelists to comment on that question, because I think that, you know, Beth's question really is sort of like the theme of this webinar.
Thank you all so much again for just taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today on our webinar. We certainly appreciate your participation. The questions were excellent. This was such an informative webinar. Dr. Beaupre, Dr. DeMello, Mr. Holmes, Mrs. Kelly Wright Nelson, Thank you again for your wonderful presentations and your wealth of knowledge of information that you brought to us regarding prison victimization. I think everyone has gotten something out of this today. So again, just please remember to complete your webinar survey and to receive your attendance certificate, as Alyssa stated earlier. Thank you again for your participation, and you all have a wonderful day.